Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us for Equitable Growth 2021, Evidence for a Stronger Economic Future. I'm Michelle Holder, President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Since its inception in 2013, Equitable Growth's mission has been to advance evidence-based ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broadly shared growth. I've admired Equitable Growth since its inception, and I'm now thrilled to take the helm as its leader to help further its mission. After all, Equitable Growth's mission hits home for me. As a labor economist, my research examines why some groups in the US workforce hold a more favorable status, while other groups hold a less favorable one. I also look at the consequences of this stratification and how it contributes to marginalization, and ultimately, less prosperity and slower growth. My research is informed by my lived experience, which lies at the nexus of characteristics associated with marginalization and cuts right to the heart of issues affecting the economy today. The economy is not an abstract system that we have no control over. It is made up of people like me, a second-generation immigrant, first-generation college graduate, and working mother. The economy is also a direct result of choices that policymakers make. A new day has dawned in government, and with it comes the possibility for long overdue structural changes to the economy. The coronavirus pandemic continues to expose deep fragilities in our economy, especially racial and gender inequities, that economic policymakers have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to address. Broadly shared economic growth is achievable, but a stronger, more equitable future requires deliberate policy choices coupled with a better understanding of what makes the economy grow. This is why I'm so excited to lead Equitable Growth in this moment. And this is why Equitable Growth's mission is more important and relevant than ever. Since 2013, Equitable Growth has provided more than $7 million in grants to more than 300 researchers, aiming to understand how economic inequality affects growth and stability. Just last month, we announced $1.3 million in grant funding for 2021, a new record for our organization. And we've managed to maintain this growth despite some pretty intense challenges, including the pandemic. When the pandemic-induced recession hit, Equitable Growth was prepared. Our vast body of research exploring how inequality leads to a more fragile economy when shocks occur quickly moved from abstract to concrete. The organization was able to meet the moment, connecting to bring scholars and their research to policymakers desperate for data and recommendations to help guide their work. The result of that collaboration, as well as tireless organization and advocacy from groups across the country, was the largest public program of economic relief in the nation's history. Policies that both brought immediate relief amidst the recession and helped lay the groundwork for a more equitable future. For example, in 2019, we published Recession Ready, a collection of big ideas and proposals aimed to help policymakers navigate the next recession. We were able to quickly amplify these ideas at the beginning of the coronavirus recession to help policymakers ameliorate the downturn's worst effects. There are other examples as well. We published the books Vision 2020 and Boosting Wages, which have provided evidence-based policy ideas for the new administration and Congress. In fact, in the session later today on social infrastructure as an engine for equitable growth, you will hear insights from one of the essays in Boosting Wages on how the lack of social investments contributes to market failures, such as many families' inability to find or pay for adequate childcare or cushion themselves against unexpected job loss. Our report, Restructuring Competition in the United States, helped plant the seeds for a sweeping executive order in July that aims to strengthen antitrust regulation and expand enforcement. We also published an influential paper on tax enforcement, which helps shape the debate around IRS funding. Our in-house policy experts have extensively promoted ideas and policies ranging from investing in the care economy to raising wages, understanding market competition, promoting new ways of measuring economic well-being, and combating fiscal austerity. The list goes on. We've built a foundation of research and have engaged with policymakers about the necessity for long-term structural changes to the economy to ensure it works for families up and down the income ladder. In doing so, we've helped change the narrative about what makes the economy grow. But there's more work to be done. In addition to the pandemic exposing deep fragilities in our economy, 2020 also brought with it a racial reckoning in the country. And we have continued to see the consequences of climate change take hold, most recently with the devastation wrought by Hurricane Ida and the fires in California. The current moment calls for a vision of sustained public investment in structures and institutions to spur equitable economic growth, with a focus on Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American workers, which you will hear more about today in the session I'm moderating, Envisioning a New Economic Future, What's Next? The current moment also calls for addressing inequities such as the gender and racial wage and wealth divides, and for centering people in that vision who have been ignored by policymakers for far too long. And last but not least, the current moment calls for a coherent and comprehensive vision for emerging from the pandemic stronger and more equitable, unafraid of addressing the ongoing and overlapping racial, climate, and care crises our nation faces. Public investments in these areas can spur strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth by addressing long-standing racial and income inequality, driving clean energy, and creating good jobs, as well as jumpstarting a new era of innovation. This is a moment we must continue to face head-on if we want an economy that works for everyone, not just the few. Yesterday, both Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh and Dr. Lisa Cook emphasized the importance of the current moment we face. And today, we're excited to continue exploring these and other themes. We've brought together thought leaders, policymakers, advocates, and academics to discuss innovative ideas and policy solutions to meet the current moment and create lasting change. To kick us off today, Equitable Growth grantee Carlos Avenancio-León and Kimberly Adams of Marketplace will discuss the role of systemic racism in tax policy, the effect of political power on labor market inequality, and more. Carlos is an assistant professor of finance at the University of California, San Diego. He's an economist whose work focuses on finance, labor economics, and group inequality. His research agenda focuses on equitable finance, the role of financial mechanisms in economic redistribution, and its implications for disadvantaged communities and inequality. Kimberly is a correspondent for Marketplace. She covers the intersection between politics and the economy, with a special focus on how federal policy affects the bottom line for businesses and individuals. Before I hand it over to Kimberly, I want to make two quick housekeeping notes. The first, technical questions and conversation about the session can go in the chat box. The second, I also want to remind everyone that today's event is on the record and being recorded. And with that, I hand it over to Kimberly for it is bound to be a thought-provoking conversation. Thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate the introduction, and thank you so much to the Washington Center for Equitable Growth for welcoming me to this very fascinating conversation. And hello, Carlos. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Kimberly. Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction, Equitable Growth for the invitation.
There's so much in the research that you've been doing lately I want to get into, so let's just dive right in. Throughout a lot of your work on racism and economic inequality, you tend to focus on the role of institutions rather than individuals maybe taking actions that are racist or discriminatory. What got you interested in that particular path of investigation?
I think the question, the relationship between institutions and inequality is an old and universal one, but the personal journey is different for everyone. In my personal journey, I come from Puerto Rico, which is by many metrics the second most unequal jurisdiction in the U.S. after Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of wealth in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of poverty. And this is like wealth and poverty that has been generated for centuries since the Spanish colonization. You start seeing it reflected in the institutions. I mean, I work in part in finance, and And one reason why I work in finance is because the financial institutions in Puerto Rico, and especially during the Great Recession, played a key role in fostering this separation between poverty and wealth back home. So just looking at that, those circumstances and the way they affect political system, public administration back home inform a lot of my interest in focusing on institutions and in focusing in particular about how the complexities of institutions can mask inequalities that are hard to address because they are hidden and hard to know. And then even when they are not hidden anymore because people uncover them, they're hard to correct because advocacy is hard because of this lack of transparency.
The complexities of the institution make it hard to unmask the discriminatory nature. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a big source of inequality is that many of the inequalities that are baked into the system are unknown. It doesn't mean that the disparities are not salient. The disparities are there, but the source of the disparity can be hidden. You can think about it in the context of housing. So what are the key players that you can see in housing? You can see banks. You can see the financing system, like a very complicated process is having in place. You can think about algorithmic bias. You can think about the work of Bartlett, Morse, Stanton, and Wallace in Berkeley, that they uncovered that algorithmic bias plays a key role in having disparities.
Which particular disparities for those who aren't familiar with the work?
Disparities in lending. I'm sorry.
Thank
disparities
you.
in lending between blacks and whites. And I just give that as an example. It's a complex issue. There's algorithmic bias in finance. The disparities are always there, but the reason why those disparities are happening are unclear. You see that in public administration with my work on property taxation, that I can talk a little bit later. We see this in healthcare often. And all these systems, what they have in common is that they are complex. They are not easily to assess without expertise. And even with expertise, it's hard to actually uncover that there's a disparity happening. And once that work has been done, that has been well documented that there's a disparity in place in a convincing fashion with the understanding of the mechanisms, it is still hard to make a case for advocacy because you need to educate both the people that work in those areas and also the public in general about why this is happening before action. So I think the focus on complexity is important because a lot of the inequalities that we have are driven by this, but change is hard without actually making the research.
Right. I was just trying to think about how somebody who's maybe on the other side of lending discrimination can know that the reason they didn't get their home loan is because of algorithmic bias.
Exactly, and that's part of the problem. So what do we want to do as a society? We want to have many economies figuring this out, making this clear, and making this work accessible to policymakers and people that are practitioners so that they correct the problem. And it's important to understand that these problems can exist even without active discrimination because the system itself is driving them. So just not doing anything, just changing the way people perceive race does not suffice to correct the disparity. We need an active effort, and that active effort can only be executed once we have a full understanding of how the system is actually driving these disparities.
Let's take a concrete example of that from your work, starting with some pretty hyper-local institutions, your local tax assessor's office. Now, here you have a system that is supposed to apply equally to everyone, but your research found that somehow it puts a disproportionately heavy burden on Black and Latinx homeowners. What's going on there?
I think this is a good way of actually talking about the systemic problem. So local assessments are going to be based on an evaluation of how valuable the home is. So ideally, in an equitable system that is working correctly, the assessment of the property, and assessment is the public sector valuation of the property, should be proportional to the price of the home. So if a white person owns a home of $100,000 and a black person owns a home of the same price, their assessments should be the equal. What we find is that that's not the case. And there's a few drivers of this, but one of the reasons why this inequality persists is because assessors systematically misvaluate some characteristics of the home. So if a property is expensive because it's large, it's going to be generate a different assessment that is the property is expensive because it lives close to many amenities. It lives close to the opera, close to good schools, close to good transportation. So that systemic difference in the way the valuations are doing disproportionately falls into different communities, like more richer communities and communities with like a history of segregation, like white communities, will be more likely to be in areas that have better amenities. And those amenities are underpriced on their assessment. And that generates assessments of black homes. That's one.
So just to give a concrete example of that, I could have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in a neighborhood with no amenities, has chronic underinvestment for generations, but pay the same taxes on it as a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in a neighborhood that's predominantly white with a lot of amenities that's worth a lot more.
Exactly. It would be that those amenities, they are not valued. They are valued, but they are undervalued relative to the market valuation. Whereas the bedrooms and the bathrooms are actually accurately valued. So there's like a systemic problem. And this is regardless of the racial preferences of the assessors. And that's important. Assessors not necessarily are looking at the people who live there. This is a systemic problem that is occurring in this particular context. And let me say something about this, the problem with this being institutional. So if you have an institution driving the disparity, there's a few reasons why this may be the case. So you may have the situation where the institution was discriminatory in the past, like we can think about decades or even hundreds of years. And those discrimination processes in place persist. You can here is where the work of historians is very important. Historians uncover the discriminatory roots of many systems. There's also, that is a little bit the situation with property taxation. We know the work of Andrew Carl, University of Virginia, actually shown some of the discriminatory intent in property taxation.
As in, these systems were designed with the purpose at the beginning to disproportionately harm people of color.
Exactly. What Andrew Carl and his historical work shows is that part of the intent in some areas of the United States to have property taxation is to actually, in some sense, expropriate wealth from blacks. That doesn't mean that the current assessors have the same goal. It doesn't have to be the case, but you're participating in a system that was intended, at least partially, to have that intent. So in that way, you perpetuate unknowingly what was designed many generations ago. But you're like bound, enslaved to some point to the ideas of others that may not be your own ideas. And that's a way in which institutional racism can persist.
But then how do you then talk to the people, say, who benefit from this system? As you said, it's unintentional. It's not maybe my fault that my house is valued more because I am living in a predominantly white neighborhood, or it's not my fault that someone else's home is undervalued. So how do you come up with systemic solutions for these institutional and systemic problems when it really does come down to individuals who are benefiting from a system they didn't individually design to be discriminatory?
Yeah, this is something I face on a constant basis, both as a professional and in my personal life. I think the most important thing for me to realize is that there will be people that approach a system in a self-serving way, and there's people that do not. And those people that do not may be participants because institutions are complicated. Again, you may not know the institutional roots, or even the roots were not discriminatory. Those systems, like algorithmic bias, can reflect other disparities in other areas of the economy. So many people that are participants in these systems are not self-serving. And once you recognize that, you understand that there's scope to actually convincing people. And you can convince people by, for me, there are two factors that are required, like good system of information that can be either empirical evidence of researchers, or it can be just having phone cameras, like in the context of the news. Having that additional information can change minds. The second requirement that is important for me is good systems of governance. I'm talking about voting in politics, or it can be governance system in institutions like universities or like private institutions. When you have good systems of governance and good information, you can change the mind of a few people, and those few people will have ability to actually act. And it may not sound like perhaps the sexiest way of addressing inequality. We would all like to have a silver bullet that would just eradicate inequality. But I think good policy, better policies are, I mean, I'm citing a little bit out of context and Elena Kagan here, but they are fought and won at the margins. You just need to convince a few people, and that changes policy. And this belief that I have is not just a belief I have in the abstract. I think empirical work support voting, we show that actually when Blacks have higher ability to vote, like higher protection for voting, you see the politicians, that they don't only elect better politicians, but also the politicians that didn't support their causes before start supporting their causes. So I believe that understanding that we can change the mind of a few people with good systems of governance in place, actually that can lead us to many better policies that can remediate many of these problems.
Since you brought it up, let's talk about your work on voting rights. And I'll take a moment here to encourage everyone to go and have a look at the published conversation you had with David Mitchell, the Director of Government and External Relations at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. You both go really deep into this topic, as well as some of the things that we're having to zoom through in this short conversation. But in your research, you talk about how these themes, the role of institutions and systems and what they do in terms of racial inequality, and then how that shows up in terms of economic inequality. And you draw a pretty straight line between the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and economic progress in Black communities. How did this act that was focused on voting end up playing into the economics of Black communities?
Yeah, I think voting is critical, and I think many people feel the same way. Again, as I mentioned, I think progress is made, is fought and won in the margins, and I think the Voting Rights Act is a clear example of this. You have a regulation, a piece of legislation that once it was enacted, it increased the ability of Blacks to vote. And what my co-author Abe and I are showing is that directly had an effect on the public hiring of voters. That's one of the things that happens. So once you start hiring more workers on the public sector, it makes it harder for the private sector to actually discriminate. So you start seeing that the hiring of in the private sector becomes better. There's higher wages for Blacks, and that starts reducing the inequality in the private sector between Blacks and whites. Not only that is happening, like by having better voting protections, you're also giving teeth to other regulations that you have in place. You have the Civil Rights Act enacted just 1 year prior to the Voting Rights Act. And you start seeing that the enforcement becomes better. You start also seeing that politicians, even the same politicians that were there before the enactment of the Voting Rights Act, start voting more consistently with civil rights regulation. They support civil rights regulation better. So just by having more power to vote, you're affecting the inequality that you had in place. Even if the vote doesn't have to take place, you're just changing. You're changing the objective function of the politician. And I don't think this applies only to politicians. I think this applies to all governance system. There's a key difference, I would say, from what happened in 1965 and what is happening right now. I think something that's happening right now is that a lot of the politics that we are seeing are focusing on changing the rules. Changing the rules again, who can vote and who cannot, instead of trying to address or try to convince the people that can vote. And I think that may make it a little bit more difficult going forward to both have better protections for voting, but also to reduce inequality.
You actually quantified how much of a monetary difference in terms of wages there was for people after the Voting Rights Act. Can you give us some of those numbers?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. So, our preferred estimate probably about is like 5.5% in wages. This is quite large in effect. You can think about this correcting about 20% of the wage gap between blacks and whites. So this is a meaningful difference, and this spillovers into many other things, like having more like wages will improve your well-being along many other dimensions.
How does that research inform the current debate we are having right here in Washington, the other place that you mentioned with great inequality? We're looking at the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Vote for America, all these other initiatives to improve our voting laws. How does this research and the economics of these decisions, do you think, play into what lawmakers are doing right now?
Absolutely. This is a very complex question, but I will try just to mention
in 1 minute.
In 1 minute, something Abe and I documented that as a result of Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, you start seeing already erosions in the gains that Black had in the United States. In particular, we see that the new public sector hiring of Blacks starts being of lower quality than what we had before. So the concern is that erosion of voting protections will actually have stronger effects, especially after 2020. We documented that in 2019, but after 2020, this effect is going to be even stronger. So I think the most important thing to recognize is by failing to protect voting rights, we are actually going to start seeing an erosion of the gains we already have. Instead of actually, if we have those additional voting rights, we could keep moving in a direction of progress.
Carlos Avenancio-León, thank you so much for this lovely conversation. I really appreciate it. And again, I would encourage everyone to look at that conversation that he had with David Mitchell. It's super fascinating and goes into a lot more detail about all these topics. Michelle, back to you.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Kimberly and Carlos, for a stimulating conversation. I can't wait to dive more into discussing this new government moment and building a stronger, more equitable economic future.